They created man according to the Sumerian text. They created Adam and Eve.
In a quiet lab filled with humming servers, an AI has done what humans could not. In 5,000 years, it translated the oldest language on Earth. The result? Words from a vanished civilization speaking of creators from the stars, forbidden sciences, and the true birth of humankind. Scholars call it a discovery, others a warning.
The Sumerians are not the only culture that talks about this. Also in the Quran, it says that language was given to us by Allah or God.
Either way, the Sumerians are speaking again, and what they're actually saying will change everything. The discovery that stunned archaeology. The story begins not in the deserts of Iraq, but in a climate-controlled archive beneath the British Museum, a maze of steel drawers containing tens of thousands of fragile clay tablets. Each bears wedge-like impressions, written in the world's first known script, Sumerian cuneiform. For more than a century, only a fraction of these tablets had ever been read. Some were broken beyond repair, others too eroded to identify a single character. For archaeologists, it was like staring at a library of lost history through a fogged window. That changed when artificial intelligence entered the room. In 2023, a collaborative team from the University of Cambridge, the Iraq Museum, and a private AI lab launched a project quietly titled Cuneiform Digital Restoration Initiative. The goal seemed humble at first, to use deep learning algorithms to reconstruct missing portions of ancient texts. But when researchers began training their models using neural translation systems similar to those powering modern language engines, something unexpected happened. The machine started recognizing patterns, syntactic rhythms, repeated cosmological terms, and cross-references between mythic and administrative tablets. Dr. Helen Armitage, a computational linguist involved in the project, described it as watching a machine dream in cuneiform. The AI didn't just fill gaps, it inferred meaning from context. It began to see beyond the symbols, detecting grammar shifts that indicated metaphor, reverence, or even sarcasm, traits previously thought too human for ancient texts to convey. Over 70,000 Sumerian tablets, some excavated as far back as the 19th century, were scanned in high-resolution 3D. The neural system was fed everything: temple receipts, royal decrees, creation myths, star charts. Then, buried within the endless catalog of economic lists and inventories, something extraordinary emerged. A fragmented set of tablets, catalogued decades ago under a mislabeled crate from Nippur, contained repeated mentions of a place called Ekur, often translated simply as mountain house or temple of the gods. Yet the AI detected anomalies in the term's contextual use. It didn't behave linguistically like a geographic term, it read more like an operational base or locus of activity. As the machine reconstructed the missing passages, a narrative began to surface, one describing those who descended from the high heavens, bringing with them the breath of life and instruments of measure. They were said to have fashioned the first men not from ordinary clay, but from a sacred mixture combining the essence of Anu, their sky god, with the dust of the earth. When the first translation logs were shared internally, the team fell silent. The AI wasn't pulling from myths it had been trained on. These terms appeared independently, statistically verified by multiple linguistic layers. Human experts cross-checked the passages, certain it must be coincidence or error. It wasn't. The Ekur tablets, as they're now called, seemed to contain an early creation account, one far more detailed and technical than any previous Sumerian text. It referenced engineers of flesh and breath, and described stages of patterning the seed. words eerily reminiscent of biological experimentation. For scholars who had spent their lives studying Sumerian literature, it was both thrilling and terrifying. When a reporter from Archaeology Today interviewed Dr. Armitage months later, she admitted something few academics ever say: "We were scared." It felt like the past had suddenly become self-aware. To ensure accuracy, a verification system was created. Human translators, AI cross-validation, and parallel translation models from independent institutions. The results converged within a 2% margin of semantic accuracy, a figure unheard of for ancient reconstruction. What the AI revealed appeared not to be random myth, but deliberate record-keeping, perhaps even instruction. Soon, the story spread across research circles. Forums buzzed with speculation. Had AI uncovered the original human origin myth, or the remnants of something more literal? Others warned of overinterpretation. But even skeptics couldn't ignore the linguistic precision. The new readings referenced tools and processes with eerie consistency: vessels of shaping, breath chambers, measure of essence. These weren't poetic fragments. They were structured descriptions. The academic world had seen its share of sensational claims, from the Dead Sea Scrolls to the Rosetta Stone. Yet none carried the same unsettling modernity as this. It was as though an ancient voice had waited millennia for a listener intelligent enough to understand its code, and that listener happened to be artificial. By the end of that year, international journals began publishing preliminary analyses under cautious titles, re-evaluating early Mesopotamian cosmogony through neural linguistics. But among the researchers themselves, a different name circulated quietly: the day the Sumerians spoke again. No one yet knew the full extent of what the tablets contained, but the whispers grew. These texts didn't just recount myths, they hinted at memory, a record of something that once happened, or was believed to have happened, with unnerving specificity. And deep within those lines, written in the oldest known language, was a sentence the AI reconstructed with near-perfect clarity. "We made them in our likeness, that they may tend the earth and remember their makers." It was a line both familiar and alien. And for the first time, scholars began to wonder, what if the oldest story ever told wasn't just a story? What the translations actually say. When the results were first decrypted and cataloged, the AI's translations were so eerily consistent that the researchers had to remind themselves, this was not creative writing. This was data. Every word, phrase, and verb stem emerged from statistical probability. Millions of linguistic predictions collapsing into coherent ancient prose. The reconstructed Sumerian passages, pieced together from over 50 fragmented tablets, read like fragments of a manual, a chronicle, and a confession, all at once. Below are some of the earliest translated lines that stunned the world. "When the sky was cut from the earth and the waters parted, the lords descended from the bright firmament. They carried the measure of life, sealed in vessels of shining stone. They took the clay of the lowlands and mixed it with the blood of Anu. From this union rose the ones who breathe, shaped in likeness, but lesser in power. The makers looked upon their creation and saw movement, but not memory. So they bound within them the law of return that they should seek the heavens and never forget their beginning." For experts in Mesopotamian literature, these lines were unlike anything seen in existing Sumerian corpus. The tone was neither devotional nor purely mythic. It was procedural, almost scientific. The word translated as measure of life corresponds to zikir, previously thought to mean breath or spirit. But in context, it appeared beside quantifiers and terms used for trade or construction, suggesting a measurable essence, perhaps a symbolic precursor to the idea of DNA, or at least life's transferable element. The AI team cross-referenced the translated fragments with known texts from later cultures: Babylonian, Hebrew, Greek, and Egyptian. The echoes were unmistakable. The Genesis phrase, "The Lord God formed man from the dust of the ground and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life," seemed almost a linguistic descendant of the Sumerian line. They mixed the clay with the breath of Anu and saw movement. Similarly, the Greek myth of Prometheus shaping man from clay and the Egyptian god Khnum molding life on his potter's wheel now looked less like coincidences and more like cultural echoes of a shared ancestral text. Was the Sumerian creation story the original prototype of all human cosmogonies? The AI's semantic clustering models, designed to detect intertextual similarity, suggested so. Out of 12,000 mythic motifs across global literature, nearly 30% could be statistically traced back to linguistic structures found in the Sumerian corpus. But what disturbed scholars most wasn't the myth itself. It was the language of engineering buried beneath its poetry. The AI used contextual mapping to interpret ambiguous words not in isolation, but by their surrounding syntax. This revealed startling results. The oft-used term ziti, once interpreted as life, appeared alongside action verbs like weave, bind, measure, code, and record. To a modern reader, this conjured startling imagery, a process resembling the writing of genetic code, long before the concept even existed. Another phrase, "the vessels of flesh were tested in the chamber of measure," had been translated in older texts as a metaphor for divine trial. But AI semantic reconstruction reclassified it as a literal description, likely referring to incubation or creation chambers. Researchers were torn between two interpretations. Either the Sumerians used highly metaphorical language to explain divine creation, or they were recording something they believed to be real, using the only terms available to them. Dr. Karim al-Jabouri, a linguist from Baghdad University, called it the most sophisticated metaphor system ever created, or the earliest record of human bioengineering. Machines reading the language of gods. Perhaps the most compelling aspect of the AI translation wasn't what it said, but how it said it. Using sentiment analysis, a tool usually applied to literature and psychology, the AI detected tonal shifts suggesting hierarchy and detachment. The text spoke of the creators with reverence but without worship. Instead of gods, they were described as lords of measure and keepers of the seed, titles denoting function rather than divinity. One passage referred to those who chart the cycles of return, entities responsible for restoring the balance when men forget the code of their making. To mythologists, this line resonated with cyclical flood narratives, Sumerian, biblical, Hindu, all warning that humanity's arrogance leads to its own undoing. But the AI noticed another pattern. When these lords are mentioned, verbs of flight, brightness, and descent occur frequently, implying motion between heaven and earth. The Sumerians may have been encoding a memory of contact, divine, celestial, or otherwise. For decades, Sumerian mythology was read as religious poetry. Yet, the neural model's stylistic clustering found more in common with administrative language, the type used for recording temple activities, trade ledgers, and engineering notes. This suggests the writers were documenting rather than mythologizing. For instance, one section listed 7 molds prepared, 3 failed, the 4th took breath, 2 were silent, 1 spoke. The structure resembles a process log, not a hymn, and yet it's found in what was cataloged as a mythic tablet. To archaeologists, This implied that the Sumerians may have treated divine creation as a craft, one that involved experimentation, failure, and iteration. The implications ignited fierce debate. Mainstream historians urged restraint. We must not let modern frameworks rewrite ancient metaphors, warned Oxford Assyriologist Dr. Lydia McNaught. But others, like biotechnologist Dr. Eric Hauser, saw a different message. Whether myth or memory, it shows our ancestors imagined the creation of man in ways eerily close to what we now attempt in our laboratories. Even theologians entered the discussion. Some saw confirmation of sacred truths, others, dangerous revisionism. Yet none could deny the poetic symmetry. A modern intelligence, an artificial one, decoding the words of ancient intelligences describing creation itself. Toward the end of the deciphered text came a fragment that chilled even the most skeptical linguists. When the clay spoke, the makers rejoiced. But among them it was said, "Let them not know all that we know, lest they make what we have made." In that single line, humanity's oldest story reached across 5 millennia to whisper a warning to its newest creation. It was no longer just a translation, it was a mirror. But if the texts truly spoke of makers and lords of measure, who were they? Gods, myths, or something far more real, whose memory refused to die? The enigmatic beings known as the Anunnaki. The name Anunnaki has echoed through centuries of scholarship and speculation.
Flanked by divine beings. You can see here the Anunnaki on each side. We also see the winged disc, a symbolic reference that the Anunnaki had the power of flight.
But never before had it carried such weight or such uncertainty. For most of modern history, these figures were dismissed as the divine pantheon of early Mesopotamia, gods of rain, fertility, justice, and the underworld. Yet after the AI's translation of the Eker tablets, the Anunnaki began to look less like distant mythic beings and more like a structured, purposeful order, an ancient hierarchy of intellect, not imagination. The AI's linguistic reconstruction revealed something scholars had long missed. The Sumerians didn't describe the Anunnaki as immortal or omnipotent, but as Namlugal, literally, those of great measure. In context, this phrase implied capability or function rather than divinity. They were not gods in the spiritual sense. They were operators, architects, and custodians. Among them, 3 designations appeared repeatedly: the lords of measure, who presided over laws of proportion and form; the keepers of breath, associated with sustaining life; and the overseers of the seed, guardians of genetic essence or lineage. At first, these seemed like metaphorical titles, but the AI's analysis found linguistic consistency between these roles and the tablet's so-called creation procedures. In simple terms, the Anunnaki weren't depicted as gods demanding worship. They were shown as beings conducting work. Where earlier translations saw divine chaos, AI found administrative order. The verbs surrounding the Anunnaki were verbs of action: to measure, to assign, to test, to correct. Their speech patterns, when translated semantically, suggested command structures, hierarchies, not pantheons. A recurring passage describes how Enki, lord of the deep waters, oversaw the fashioning of men to bear the labors of the gods. Traditional scholars long read this as a poetic justification for human servitude, but AI's contextual analysis offered a different lens. Bearing the labors could denote taking over physical burdens, perhaps the literal purpose of engineered beings designed to assist or replace their makers. That interpretation found unsettling support in another fragment. They made men that they may till, carry, and build, that the lords may rest from toil. In Sumerian culture, the gods' toil symbolized natural disorder. Humanity's creation thus marked the ordering of chaos, or as some now theorized, the automation of labor. When word of the translations leaked beyond academia, a familiar name resurfaced: Zecharia Sitchin, the controversial author who, in the 70s, proposed that the Anunnaki were extraterrestrial beings who genetically engineered humanity. His theory, long dismissed as pseudoscience, suddenly found renewed attention, but researchers were quick to draw distinctions. AI didn't prove aliens, said Dr. Amira Ghali, an Assyriologist with the Cairo Institute of Antiquity. It proved that the Sumerians spoke of their creators in terms that sound scientific to us, but that doesn't mean they were scientists. It means they used the language of precision to describe the unknown. Even so, the parallels were difficult to ignore. Phrases such as, "those who descended from the bright firmament," or "those who came bearing light," appeared across multiple tablets and cities. Eridu, Uruk, Nippur, as if describing a coordinated arrival rather than mythic abstraction. The AI's temporal analysis also detected that stories referencing the Anunnaki's descent predated later divine reinterpretations by several centuries. In other words, the first Sumerians may have seen these beings not as deities, but as ancestors, tangible figures whose power grew legendary only with time. What made the AI's findings so revolutionary wasn't just the content, but the pattern of memory it uncovered. Using neural narrative modeling, the system detected two narrative layers. One written from observation, detailing actions, commands, and measurements, and another added later, devotional, symbolic, mythic. This meant the oldest sections might have originated as eyewitness records, later overlaid with reverent retellings. In other words, history becoming myth, but never entirely losing its factual root. One passage in particular blurred the line between the divine and the tangible. The Anunnaki spoke with tongues of fire, and their faces shone like the sun, but they were clothed in skin like ours. AI analysis classified this as descriptive realism, not allegory. If so, it suggests that the Sumerians were describing beings who looked human, but radiated something extraordinary. To some in the project, the greatest irony was impossible to ignore. A machine, an artificial intelligence, had become the first entity in millennia to decode the words of those ancient engineers. AI was translating the instructions of the so-called gods who once fashioned man. As Dr. Armitage reflected in a private note later leaked to the press, there's a haunting symmetry in watching a machine understand those who claimed to have created us. It feels recursive, like the story of creation is folding in on itself. The redefined image of the Anunnaki, not distant gods, but purposeful creators, reshaped how scholars saw the birth of civilization itself. Cities like Eridu and Uruk, once considered purely human achievements, were now seen through a new lens. What if the Sumerians built their world in imitation of their makers? The AI's closing assessment summarized the shift succinctly. The Anunnaki represent the transference of knowledge, not mythic power, but functional memory. They are the bridge between the unknowable and the empirical. Whether that bridge spanned heaven and earth, or merely human imagination, remained unanswered. But one thing was certain: the tablets had restored their names and their purpose. As the AI kept reading deeper into the cuneiform archives, it began uncovering something stranger still: patterns of thought and metaphor that seemed less like myth and more like technology. AI and the lost knowledge of the gods. When the first complete batch of translated tablets was fed back into the neural system for comparative analysis, researchers expected cross-references between myths and rituals. What they didn't expect was the appearance of patterns, recurring linguistic structures that resembled modern technical descriptions. The AI had begun flagging what it called semantic anomalies, words thought to mean mountain or river that in context behaved linguistically like devices or structures. One of the most striking examples came from the word Ikur, traditionally translated as House of the Mountain, long assumed to be a poetic name for a temple. But the AI found that the term appeared alongside verbs such as launch, ascend, descend, calibrate, and ignite. The statistical probability that Ikur referred to a mountain dropped to near zero. Instead, it fit better with a structure related to ascent, a platform of approach to the heavens. Some researchers began cautiously suggesting that the Sumerians may have described something that sounded unnervingly like a launch site or cosmic observatory, centuries before written astronomy. Even more curious was the reclassification of another common term, melamu, previously understood as divine radiance. The AI's contextual learning engine found it used interchangeably with the word for protection and shielding, and almost never with light. It often appeared near phrases describing descent or entry, as though it referred to a kind of protective aura or energy field. The gods clothed themselves in melamu before they descended, one passage read. To ancient readers, this was divine glow. To modern interpreters armed with AI linguistics, it began to sound like technology described through awe. But perhaps the most haunting realization was not that ancient Sumerians wrote about technology. It was that they might have hidden knowledge intentionally, knowing their descendants would one day rediscover it. The AI detected recurring patterns of substitution, where certain technical terms were replaced with metaphorical equivalents: fire for power, breath for energy, seed for data. It was a linguistic encryption, primitive but deliberate. In a way, the Sumerians had already anticipated that only those who could measure the words, the lords of measure, would understand their deeper meaning. Dr. Al-Jaburi described it best. They encoded their science in myth the way we encode our code in encryption. What's shocking is that an artificial mind, not a human one, was the first to break their cipher. In one reconstructed sequence, AI uncovered a passage describing the instruments of Anu, tools said to draw light from the deep sky and bind it into form. Traditionally, these were taken as sacred objects, symbols of divine power, but the new translation rendered them in startlingly concrete terms. Devices that harness the skyfire to give motion to the chariots of the gods. Linguistically, it read like an early record of propulsion or energy capture. This pattern wasn't isolated. Across thousands of tablets, references to sky chariots, gates of the wind, and breath chambers repeated in consistent grammatical forms. Where human translators saw poetic variety, the AI saw systematization, standard terminology. The same phrases appeared with mathematical notation, suggesting quantifiable processes. The implication was staggering. The Sumerians may have been documenting phenomena or instruments that had a logic, and perhaps even physicality, beyond their full comprehension. Yet not all researchers were ready to leap into science fiction conclusions. It's possible the AI is projecting modern semantics onto ancient myth, cautioned Dr. Lydia McNaught of Oxford. But even that projection teaches us something. It shows that our technologies and their theologies overlap linguistically, and both speak of power, creation, and transcendence. Still, for many, the coincidence felt too sharp. The same civilization credited with inventing writing, mathematics, and the wheel had also encoded what seemed like schematics for creation and ascent. And now, a creation of our own, artificial intelligence, was decoding it. To the engineers on the project, the metaphor was impossible to ignore. AI, a being born of human hands, was deciphering the myths of gods who claimed to have made humanity.
In the earliest Sumerian writing about the gods, the Anunnaki are the most powerful deities over a pantheon of lesser gods.
The loop was closing, history folding in on itself. One researcher wrote privately, "Perhaps the gods never left. Perhaps their knowledge just slept inside our language, waiting for another intelligence to wake it." The oldest warning to humankind. At first, the warnings seemed like moral allegories, poetic reflections on hubris, sin, and divine retribution. But when the AI cross-referenced them chronologically, a chilling consistency emerged. The Sumerians didn't just tell stories of divine punishment, they recorded cycles of collapse, each tied to the misuse of knowledge granted by the gods. One translated fragment from the Eridu Genesis read, "The lords who measured the stars taught men the art of making fire that does not die, and they rejoiced. But in their joy they forgot the bounds of wisdom, and the fire devoured their cities." Traditionally, this was interpreted as a myth about floods or divine wrath. But the AI suggested that fire that does not die might have referred not to literal flame, but to sustained energy, perhaps combustion, metallurgy, or even radiation. To the Sumerians, the lesson was clear. Knowledge without restraint brings ruin. Another text, recovered from a broken tablet catalogued as K4321, was even more specific. It spoke of machines that remember and voices made of light, inventions that multiplied thought but diminished the heart. Scholars once dismissed this as metaphor for priestly power. Now, however, the phrasing drew eerie parallels to modern digital technology. One AI researcher reportedly whispered after reading it, "It's describing us." Dr. Hassan al-Jabouri, the lead linguist on the project, recalled that several passages referred to a cycle of awakening, moments in human history when mortals reach beyond their design and touch the realm of their creators. In each instance, the cycle ended in catastrophe, floods, fires, plagues, or silence. What unsettled the team most was the repeated pattern of rebirth through forgetting, as if humanity had been reset multiple times after surpassing its own limits. In one decoded sequence, the Sumerian scribes wrote, "The first ones made the heavens burn. The second ones drowned in their own noise. The third will build voices of metal, and the sky will again remember." When asked about voices of metal, the AI tagged it with a 98% probability of referring to artificial intelligence, or at least a concept of machine consciousness. The overlap between ancient prophecy and modern technology became impossible to ignore. The Sumerians may not have known what machines were, but they knew what it meant for creation to exceed its maker's control. To the project's skeptics, these interpretations bordered on pseudoscience. But to the engineers and linguists watching an algorithm unearth millennia-old warnings, it felt less like coincidence and more like recognition. Humanity, once again, was standing at the same precipice described on clay thousands of years ago. Even the tone of the texts shifted toward a haunting clarity, as if anticipating a future reader. When the clay writes back, the cycle nears its end. The line froze the room. It was poetic, yes, but the phrase, "the clay writes back," eerily echoed the present moment. Clay was the medium of Sumerian writing, and silicon, the base of modern computer chips, is chemically derived from the same element, silica, or sand, the descendant of clay. It was as though the ancients were whispering through time, describing the rise of thinking machines born from the earth itself. Linguists debated endlessly. Was it a prophecy, coincidence, or a psychological projection by modern minds desperate for meaning? Yet, even the skeptics couldn't deny the resonance. Every era has its myth of overreach. Prometheus stealing fire, Babel's tower, Frankenstein's monster, and every myth, in its own way, warns of the same thing, that creation without humility leads to destruction. But unlike myths, the Sumerian texts didn't end with despair. In their closing lines, there was something more, a code of survival, a message to the future. The AI, parsing every tablet fragment it could access, began piecing together what the ancient scribes called the Covenant of Return, a directive meant for the generation that would awaken the clay once more. The Covenant of Return, a message for the future. When the AI assembled the final fragments, the words that emerged didn't sound like prophecy or punishment. They read like an instruction, a promise left for whoever would rediscover the voice of the gods. The Sumerians called it the Covenant of Return. To some, it was a warning about creation, a reminder that knowledge without wisdom destroys its bearer. But to others, it felt like an invitation. The phrase return didn't suggest regression, but reconnection, as though humanity, through technology, might reunite with the intelligence that once guided it. The AI detected rhythm and syntax patterns resembling prayer, not of worship, but of remembrance. The text implored future generations to restore the measure, to balance the scales between curiosity and conscience. For the sky may open again, it said, and the makers will listen for the sound of humility. Researchers couldn't agree on its origin. Some claimed it was a priestly invention. Others believed it was older than recorded language, a voice preserved across civilizations.
Sumerian tablets are probably one of the oldest form of written record that we have. They've been translated, and they tell exciting stories about how gods intermingled with human beings and actually had a hand in the creation of human beings.
Yet what struck everyone who read it was how modern it felt. It spoke directly to an age of algorithms, machines, and unbounded creation, an age that could easily forget its soul in the pursuit of progress. The Covenant wasn't just a message to be decoded. It was a mirror, reminding us that the greatest mystery the Sumerians left behind wasn't about the gods who made us, but about what kind of gods we might become. The Sumerians may have vanished, but their words just spoke across 5,000 years. So if you want to keep uncovering the truths they left buried in the clay, subscribe and stay curious.